Hello, my name is Tim Wilmot and welcome to my watercolor demo of a scene with figures and shadows. In this watercolor we'll be covering a few watercolor techniques like laying down a wash, wet in wet, blending colors, negative painting as in painting around figures and vehicles, plus some dry brush strokes as well. I'll also take you through the steps I go through in a painting, the various stages, and covering such things as timings. Now, those of you who see my previous demos, you'll know that I paint in a loose style or an impressionistic style. Now, the subject for my painting today is a scene of Porthleven in Cornwall, UK. I think it makes a good subject for a watercolor, for a painting, because we've got the light coming towards us, so we've got lots of areas of high contrast, the difference between light and dark. We have on the left hand side a nice frame with the building in dark shadow. We've got some figures there, we've got some in shadows, some out in the light. We've got some vehicles, their tops in contrast, hitting some sunlight in contrast with the background buildings. And on the right hand side we've got a little bit of framing with the right hand side of the harbour. There's a pub there over on the right hand side and some tall poles, telegraph poles, masts of boats and so on. So our first step is to make a preliminary outline sketch, and I'm using a 3B pencil. The paper I'm using is Saunders Waterford Rough 300 grams. Now, as the focus is on figures, I'm actually going to start drawing in the outline of my key figures. Sometimes I would actually start with the background buildings or on the left hand side, but on this occasion I'm actually going to draw in the figures first and then draw the background buildings, the left hand building around those figures. So notice the heads are all level, and my primary figure on the left hand side, I started that first. That's the one that's going to emerge from the shadows, and then careful not to have anything slap bang in the middle. It's generally a good idea to have focal points just slightly off center. So I've got a couple of figures over on the right hand side, two figures there on in the background, and I'm just loosely drawing in where their shadows will fall. And now another figure. At this stage I'm also trying to think whether the figures are coming towards us or away from us. And as you can see, I start with the head, and then as it evolves I kind of work out whether it's going to be going away or coming forwards or going to the left or going to the right. So that's the right hand figure there balancing the left hand figure, and now loosely drawing in the background. Careful to make sure those background buildings are going to be encasing those background figures, so we can throw a little bit of contrast on top of their heads and shoulders. So now that left hand building has come down to the left hand shoulder of the primary figure, and I've drawn the shadow coming away from top left to bottom right. Loosely drawing in the background. There's the wall to the right, some vehicles in the center there. And we might get a little dog there This is it's a popular town for people walking their dogs around the harbour. So this right hand figure, we're going to have its right leg going forwards, the left leg just behind. Careful to draw in some arms, just indicating where the arms will be, and also now the faces. So I'm just scribbling in those faces just so I know for a reference point of view whether they're going to come towards me or going away. And now a bit of an exercise in perspective, so standing back and loosely drawing in those main guidelines. They're also leading the eye into the composition as well. Some may be painted over, others I will try and follow. And then there's a sign there for the pub. There's actually the building on the left hand side is one of the main pubs in Porthleven. So I think we're almost done with the preliminary drawing. Now I'm just putting on a little bit of clear water here because I want to make sure that it's not too dark in the sky on the left hand side there. So add in a bit of water just so that we can lead a light wash into that area and try not to paint over it. So actually the board is on a slight angle as well. Today a lot of people ask me, is this flat? It's actually at a sort of 10-degree angle. It's just a slight angle. So I'm using cerulean blue for the sky, going quite dark in the top right corner because that's furthest away from where the light is coming from. So making sure the left-hand sky is left very light, and over on the right-hand side a little bit darker. Now a bit of yellow ochre here, just where the sky meets the horizon. Again, a little bit more intense on the right-hand side, trying to preserve that light area in the middle. Left-hand building. Now this is just the undercoat. This is not going to be the end colour. This is just to really cover up that left-hand side. Alizarin crimson, burnt sienna. I should actually go through the palette here on the right-hand side. From the top, we've got neutral tint. You'll see me use that for the shadows. Then second down is burnt umber, then burnt sienna, yellow ochre. We've got some viridian green, cobalt turquoise, cerulean blue, cobalt blue, ultramarine blue, alizarin crimson, cadmium red, light red, cadmium orange, two up from the bottom, and cadmium yellow. So we're now coming into the road, the foreground, keeping it all quite moist and damp. And as we're coming down towards us, we're going to get a little bit more intense with the wash. Bit of ultramarine blue, alizarin crimson, trying to warm it up a little bit as we come towards us. So these are quite random strokes here, because if you look at most roads, they're not a uniform colour. They're just, we've looked at them closely, they can be consisting of lots of colours, especially when we're looking towards the light. So I'm still, while the road wash is still moist, I'm adding colours back into it. Now from a timing point of view, you can't go on adding in colour to that wash. There's a sort of optimum time when you can do this, when it's best to do this. If you leave it too long as it's drying, then you get the horrible cauliflowers appearing and some distortion in that wash. So you've got to be very, very careful with the timings. Bottom left hand corner, quite dark. Alizarin crimson, burnt sienna. This will actually go a good deal lighter when it dries. So you've got to be thinking as you're laying your wash, it is going to go lighter inevitably. So maybe try and go a little bit darker than you might do. So I think we're almost done on the initial wash there. So just to recap, we've got the sky painted in very loosely. You can see that a couple of random clouds were left as well. Quite fortunate. And then we came down into the background, the left-hand buildings and the actual road there, just to cover up all the main areas, trying to paint around or keep left unpainted obviously where the sunlight's coming from and the vehicles and a couple of the figures as well. So we've now got to let that wash dry completely, 100% dry, and this is where I would speed up the process using a hairdryer, just going all over the entire painting surface to make sure it's absolutely bone dry. So the next stage will be to add in the background. Now for this I'm using a slightly different brush. The first brush I used was a mop brush from a Skoda. It's long since lost its point, but it's still a very good brush, natural hair, very good for laying down that initial wash. With this second stage I need a bit more precision, so this is a Raphael mop brush. It's synthetic hairs, and you can see it's got quite a nice point and a flat edge as well, so I'm just using that flat edge to my advantage in the definition of the rooftops of the background buildings, and a bit more precision going around the figures as well. Not too precise, after all we are painting in a loose style. And notice the way I'm holding the brush, I'm not holding it down towards the business end of the brush, I'm holding it sort of halfway up, almost at the end of the brush, which again I find does help you paint in slightly a looser style as well. I'm actually standing up as well doing this painting, not sat down. So background buildings, leaving out just a few little areas where the sun is hitting some rooftops, and we painted around slap bang in the middle. There's actually a vehicle. I'm going to have a vehicle there, so I was careful not to paint over the entire top of that vehicle top. We're going to have a little bit of lost and found around that vehicle top. Bit of burnt sienna there. Now we're coming over to the right hand side and looking at my reference photo. It's a little bit warmer on this right hand side, painting around figure number 2, primary figure on the right hand side. Now the middle of the harbour, which is where I'm at now, it's just a mass of different shapes and lines where the harbour wall is, and lots of objects sat on the top of the harbour and tops of boats and so on in the harbour below. So I'm just really being extremely casual with that approach. Now on the right hand side we've got this building. It's actually another pub on the right hand side. So there's a pub on the left, pub on the right. So just in my palette, I'm just picking up any sort of darker colour here for the base of the shadows, and now I'm now defining that vehicle with the windscreen. Do you see in the underneath the chassis and the shadow below it? It's just basically two bands that define a vehicle or a car. Quite simple. Made even simpler when it's coming towards us. Bit of dark on the right hand side with trees and the right hand pub, a bit of the wall in shadow. So alizarin crimson, burnt sienna, ultramarine blue. Quite a dark mix. Just making sure I get the right consistency. Mixing around. So now for the left hand building, which is good to approach this now because those background buildings have had a little bit of a time to dry, but it doesn't matter actually if when I do this left hand side it bleeds a little bit into the background buildings. That doesn't matter. So as I'm coming down this building, you notice I just turned the brush on its side just to quickly have some change in the intensity of the colour. It can't all be too flat and one monotonous tone. So we've got some bay windows on the front of the pub on the first floor, and a little bit of light coming through the windows. We're looking at the windows side on. So I'm just observing that rooftop line, this diagonal line coming from top left to bottom right, and then carefully painting around primary figure number 1, our focal point. So just defining a few windows and other minor architectural details of this left-hand building. And as you come down, it doesn't matter if you, I mean, my particular style is I do leave out these little specks of light. They could be anything. In fact, we can turn them into things later on. Tops of posts, for example, tiles catching the light. So as I'm coming down, I'm going a bit cooler. Add a bit of cobalt blue into the shadows as it's hitting the road surface. So we're going to have the primary figure's legs joining the shadow. So I'm trying to keep it all quite wet. As the shadow comes further away from the building, it's obviously a little bit more out of focus. It's not so sharp, the line. Just adding in a bit of weaker wash there, and it's going to bleed a little bit. The top bit's just bleeding a little bit into that, which is just what I want. So that's the background done and the left-hand building. Now we can start doing a little bit of figure work. So I'm making up, I usually start with the faces first of all. As I started with the drawing of the faces, I paint the faces first, and it's just really a mix of light red here that's been mixed with a bit of cad red perhaps, a bit of cadmium orange. Starting with those two background figures, just a very simple splodge for their face, and then quickly doing the arms. And then their tops. You could leave them white, but as we are looking towards the light, they're not going to be pure white, and we might want to try and leave just a little bit of unpainted paper on their shoulders. Let's try and make this second figure a little bit, have the top a little bit different to the first figure there. It's going to be a little bit darker. So this person might be wearing a jacket or something. And then back to the first figure. Legs, not too precise, just lines, and sometimes not completely coming down to the ground, giving some indication of movement. You can also use dry brush strokes. I sometimes do legs with a dry brush stroke, so making sure that there's not too much moisture on the brush. I'm using a small to medium-sized synthetic brush here with a good point, and with a bit of practice you can draw figures with a dry brush stroke. It does sometimes give the effect of a little bit more movement, especially around the legs if you use a dry brush stroke quickly. Now the shadows. Trying to think of where the light's coming from. And then third and fourth figures. Starting with their heads. So see, these are obviously walking away from us. And figure number 3 is going to have a bluish top, so that's cobalt blue. So just testing it a little bit, try and make this figure a little bit lighter. And then for the legs, so a slightly drier brush stroke there, not too much moisture on the brush at this stage. And then the shadows for figures 3 and 4. Making sure I've got a nice point, nice flat edge to the brush. And connecting with the larger figure on the right hand side. Just while I've got that brush, I'm just dabbing around other areas as I see fit, just to add in a bit more detail. Just over in the top right corner, you can't see it, there's actually a sponge. It's quite useful just to extract quickly out of the brush any unwanted pigment, moisture, whatever. Right, so main figure on the right hand side, done the face, couple of hands. Back with a bigger brush now, because it's a bigger figure. Right, this main figure on the left hand side, got to get that in quickly. I should really ideally have done this maybe a little bit earlier, just while the paint on the left hand side, the wash on the left hand side is still quite moist, but I think I'm all right. So quickly paint this figure in. Leg number 1, leg number 2, down into the shadows, and let it bleed just a little bit into the shadows. So the little bit of clearer water there, just drop in with the brush, drop in a bit of water onto those legs, and it will come down, travel down the page. Not too fast in this example because I've got quite a shallow angle. Right, back to that right hand figure, again with this Raphael brush. I think it's a size 16 brush. So jacket, coming down to the hips, and then the right leg, left leg behind the right, giving a sense of movement and walking. Now the shadows, notice that edge on the brush. I just took the synthetic brush then, and so as not to leave this figure's shirt completely white, I've just added in a bit of clear water with that synthetic brush just to dirty it up a bit. I forgot the old dog. Quickly painting the dog and the shadow. And that left-hand building is still a little bit damp, but this paint is quite thick, so it doesn't it stays where I want it to go, rather than necessarily bleeding into the wash of the building there. So I'm just emphasizing the line of the base of the building there and the pavement. So now the pub sign, again with that same synthetic brush. I normally use only probably about 3 or 4 different brushes on a painting. And then we've got a few, let's do a few masks, some random masks, giving indication of the harbour over on the right hand side. Now I've got a tissue here, and while the wash is still damp, I can be lifting out with this clean tissue, just lifting out areas that I want to. And trying to connect different shapes. For example, the right hand figure with the background shadows, just pressing fairly gently with that tissue, just lifts out the required amount of paint. So let's draw in or paint in a bit of hair for that right hand figure. And when I've got some dark paint, just add in a bit more interest in various areas. So of course this is a harbour scene, we'll have a few seagulls up in the sky. Trying to make it as random as I can. Some larger birds, smaller birds. So there are some power lines about. I could have done those with a rigger brush. Now we're going to use some dry brush strokes here to emphasize the road surface and to have some lines drawing us into the picture and to help with the perspective as well. Now I'm just dabbing in a few spots here and there. Let's just try and make this figure's face a little bit darker. So I'm just using a hairdryer now. I've muted the sound of the hairdryer. I hope you don't mind. I want to make sure everything's 100% dry for the next stage. So we're getting into the finer details now. This is quite a nice hairdryer. It's not too strong, not too intense, because I've got my paper held down by masking tape, and obviously you've got to be a bit careful with the hairdryer near the masking tape. Might just come a bit loose. Not that it doesn't really matter at this stage. We've done the main washes, but just got to be a bit careful, not staying over the sides too much. So I think we need a bit more details in the building. So I've gone quite dark here, fairly thick consistency, almost pure neutral tint for some window details and bits and pieces around that bay window. Add in another line there just to assist with the perspective, and a middle support to that window, maybe a doorway there. Try not to overdo the background. Adding a bit more form to the middle of the harbour. There are quite a few horizontal lines going across there, defining the harbour wall and the top of the harbour. And then that's the right hand side of the road. Again, connecting, started from that right hand figure, dragged over to the right. So these figures are not 100% sure they're looking alright. Thinking about their legs, particularly that left hand one, not connecting one of the legs with a shadow. I might come back to that. So we're nearing the final stages now of the painting, and going to be using a little bit of white gouache, pure white gouache, straight out the tube here, with that same small synthetic brush. Probably the brush is just a little bit moist. Make sure it's absolutely clean. Don't want to contaminate the white with anything. So just adding a bit more highlight to those background figures. Maybe another car top in there. And another one. And then some masks catching the light against the dark background. So I'm still thinking about those middle figures, whether I should, against my better nature, go back in and do something to their legs. Well, here goes. I'm going to do it. Let's go back into those legs again. Just to help me connect with the shadows. Couldn't really have done anything with the shadows. I had to do it with the legs. Well, it's done now. Just doing a bit more connecting. If I see something that's a bit too intense, as you saw me do there, I just nip it in the bud very quickly, just smudge it out with your finger or a bit of tissue. Just adding a few little bits and pieces on the right hand side, paraphernalia. Sat on the harbour wall there, so I think we're done. So here is the finished painting. I hope you like it. Just to summarize, it was all about figures and shadows, and I started off doing the figures first, just fairly random figures across the page, not actually copying my reference photo. With a bit of practice you can conjure up figures in all sorts of sizes and situations and poses. So fairly random figures there. Try not to make too large a figure in the middle as well. Added a dog. We had a vehicle and some vehicles eventually in the painting. Very simple background, nothing to it at all. Left out some little highlights for where the sunlight was hitting some rooftops, and then the dark left-hand building connecting our left-hand figure into those shadows, making the shadows fade as making the edges less intense as they're coming towards us, and then colouring in the figures, trying to make them fairly random. Many figures are quite dark actually when you look at them. Dark clothing, particularly in the UK. But here I've added a little bit more interest with some different colour tops. Maybe this is sort of autumnal, summer type scene with some lighter clothing. We had the pub sign as well, adding a bit of interest on the right hand side, and a few masks there as well. So as I say, I hope you enjoyed that. Have a go yourself. You can see more of my work on my website at www.timwilmot.com. That's TIMWILMOT.com. Thanks for watching, and I hope to post another video real soon for you. Thanks very much indeed.